But what I actually think is that you and me, we walk along, we see that vision, and we're hit by something. G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. Today, I want to talk about something that people in the comments have asked me to share my thoughts on, and that is, how do I choose my locations? How do I choose my time of day? And how do I frame? How do I choose and get the frame? And this all really starts with one fundamental principle that drives everything that comes after it. And that is oh, those annoying credits, there they were. And that is trying to be original. Now, I know some of you hard-nosed people out there will laugh and scoff, and yes, you can do that. But I still think it's possible in 2020, if you apply yourself and the fact that technology is always advancing, we're actually able to do new things that we were not able to do before. A fundamental example of that was the change between film, 35mm film say, and 35mm digital. We had a profound change on how we could use film, where changing ISO or changing black and white to colour was something that you could not do on the fly. Also, choosing to just push up into 3200, 6400, this is something that you couldn't do with film without a great penalty. So things change, and by being able to shoot handheld at night, to run and gun rather than using a tripod, this profoundly changes what I was doing in 2001 versus what I can do in 2020. These are big differences. So that baseline of originality, how does it drive us? How does it inform us? So firstly, I want to talk about geography. How do you choose where you want to go? Well, the reality is that the last 10 years, the rise of digital, people going out and trying to find everything and anything to photograph, yes, most things have now been covered. So how do we make these geographical sites original again? Now, the first part of that may well be choosing the time of day. That gives us probably something like 4 to 6 different states. We've got pre-dawn, we've got the golden hour in the morning and in the afternoon, we've got midday light, and then you've got night after sunset, where the cities are light, offices are still going, businesses are going, there's activity happening, which is different to post-midnight. A lot of cities start to close down their lighting as you get later into the night. You have all these different states that you can possibly photograph in, which will allow for originality. In this city, the city wasn't being photographed at night up until the rise of digital, so the first 20 years of my career, I was largely out there on my own, perhaps with a couple of other photographers who also photographed at night. I never saw anyone else shooting ever. Early on in my career, and this is back in 1989, when I was still a student, I was really attracted to the back laneways, the back alleys of the city that I live in. I was still a teenager, and there was no one else in the 1980s photographing these spaces. I didn't see it being represented anywhere. Yet I was really attracted to them. They had a cinematic grunge. They had texture. They had juxtaposition. They were just really interesting spaces. They were timeless spaces. You could step into these back alleys and you could step 100 years back in time, because the facades on the fronts of buildings were always maintained and looked after, but the back alleys, they were just left. They were like time capsules. So this was an area that I was photographing from the late 80s through to today. I still enjoy them. They have become very popular and very trendy. This occurred sort of 15, 20 years later as the rise of street art and graffiti and stenciling populated some of these spaces. And then suddenly they became very popular. With or without street art, I still find them very interesting. But with the rise of digital, the rise of Instagram, the rise of YouTube, there are a lot more people creating images. So again, using the different lighting states, it is harder to be original. But there are still more things you can do to chase originality. And that the next step is weather. Now the weather affects light absolutely, fundamentally. It absolutely does. Now whether that's rain, which I love, or fog, which I love, they can absolutely change the geographical location that you might want to shoot at, and they change it profoundly, especially, well, no, they both do. Rain, everything glows. Suddenly the footpath, which is dull, becomes shiny and reflects everything above it. And in fog, what's amazing about fog is it doesn't matter how many different permutations you have, you are always going to see something different with fog. It will never be the same each time. It's just simply not possible. So weather, again, adds another layer of permutation. So you've got your geography, then you've got your, say, 5 states of lighting, and then you've got near on endless states when it comes to rain and how it's behaving. It might be light rain, heavy rain, thunderstorm, torrential rain, and how it's hitting the ground and what it's doing, what time of year it is will affect what the rain is doing. Is it summer? Is it winter? Is it more sleety? And then you've got endless permutations of fog. So again, this drives me. I want to stack all of these different layers of originality to find images that I don't commonly see. And then the final part of this equation is, well, you can shoot in very cinematic ways. And that comes about from all of the things we just talked about, plus your lens choice, your equipment choice. If you're shooting with, say, a prime, people say to me, oh, a 70 to 200 is not a landscape lens. What are you talking about? Jerry Bruckheimer would be out of business if he wasn't shooting with long lenses. Tony Scott, Ridley Scott, these guys, they live on them. And you've got to shoot that lens at 200mm at 2.8, or get your 135 at 1.4. This is where stuff looks most interesting. So the next thing I would suggest to you is get your equipment, get your camera, and push it to its limits. Shoot it wide open. For example, this is the system I know best. If you're shooting with the new Z Primes, any of them, you can shoot them wide open directly into the sun, as you can see in this video here, and there is in essence no penalty, but it is handling better than any previous glass in this system. And these lenses are performing at Otis level lenses, which are something like 4 times the cost. So push it to the limit. Shoot them wide open. Get that depth of field. Because why do we stop? When creating a frame, when choosing how to make the frame, why is it that we stop and take that photo? And we stop because we're walking along and we see something. And then we have to backtrack a little bit and try and recreate in a flat medium, because photography is not three-dimensional. It's mono, not stereo. So we have to create depth by using other techniques and other tools. And one of the best ways to create depth is short depth of field. The foreground and the background are clearly out of focus and your subject is in focus. This creates depth. So when shooting a landscape, a cityscape, when shooting anything, don't be afraid to push that lens to its limit and create that depth. I think it'll run a shiver down your spine when you get a result which you go, wow, I didn't know that was possible. I don't have to shoot at f8 all the time. I find it interesting that most landscape photographers that I observe seem to think it needs to be 5.6 or f8 or somewhere in there. And I would warmly and kindly and gently suggest that you're missing out on some cinematic opportunities by thinking that's the only way. So lens choice is critical. Can you get those depth of fields? Can you be more cinematic? But like I said, if you see that moment as you're walking along, you've got to backtrack and you've got to recreate the motion that you saw, and you've got to recreate the stereo vision in which we see in. And you can use your tools to do that with depth of field and the motion with slower shutter speeds by getting some movement in there. As for frame, as for the actual frame, I find this to be a difficult thing to teach you. There is the golden mean, there's the rule of thirds, etc. But ultimately, I don't think this is the only way that this happens. I think these are rules that have been created to describe certain ways of achieving things. But what I actually think is that you and me, we walk along, we see that vision, and we're hit by something. And it may not apply to those rules. And if it doesn't apply to those rules, that's okay. But you're seeing it. And one of my biggest joys out of my photography is creating balance within a frame that just simply shouldn't have balance. It shouldn't exist. It shouldn't make any sense. But somehow with colour and shapes and light and framing, there is balance that doesn't apply to any rules. So what I would suggest to you is go with your instincts. If you see something and you stop, it's not that it isn't a good shot. The first few years of my career was working out, how do I translate what I've seen in stereo with motion? How do I translate that to a flat medium with no motion? And it was just working out how to do that. And that is often a process, because you saw it and you're backtracking, of just moving forward a bit, moving back a bit, reframing a bit, maybe even zooming a bit, just using all the tools at your disposal, aperture, shutter, focal length, your legs, etc. And you will find what you saw. You just have to take the time, breathe, become a bit zen, be extremely focused on the frame. Don't worry about anything else, because once the frame is the important thing, then you can get shutter and aperture and everything else right once you have your frame. So when it comes to motion in the frame, sometimes you might be afraid. And when you're doing cities at night and lots of different things happen, you might have a fire engine or a police car, and this changes the lighting opportunities. So a city at night can offer so many variables that just keep changing. And every time you return to a same location, it might be slightly different. City skylines change, lighting changes, building changes, signage changes, and then these other moments, whether it's a police car or whatever, an ambulance, these can change things. Roadworks, and you've got to use those, bring that stuff, mix it in, because it adds to the originality.
This is the process. This is how a great shot became book cover worthy. So we are in the Focus software right here. Focus. Now Focus is Hasselblad software. These images are from my Hasselblad. Now this is the night I was confronted with. I arrived in this laneway, which is full of tagging, graffiti, stencils, some good, some bad. Anyway, that's a discussion for another day. And I was getting some images that are good. They're all okay, solid, nice, good enough. Takes a while to render it. I just want to... This is the Hasselblad. And it is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Just look at that detail. And we are zoomed in at 100%. And just off the charts. Anyway, how do we make this image better with all of the elements, stacking all the elements that we're talking about? And I'd been walking around, and then this appeared. A garbage truck. Okay, so far so good. Here's a crop of, we're just zooming into the middle of this frame, and because the Hasselblad is so good and so high res, this just all still looks delicious. Look how delicious this looks through here. And here's the truck. Still not quite there, but if we change the frame, and luckily the truck didn't leave because I'm on the tripod, we're shooting long exposures, and we end up turning, oh, well that's not going to show you. We end up turning this by moving, reframing, etc. into this. There's the movement of the garbage truck. And well, for me, I love this. And I just want to show you the Hasselblad again, zooming into 100%, and just look at the textures in here, the textures here, the textures here, the dynamic range. And look at this interesting thing that's happened to the garbage truck that was still, and then it moved. Now this is an 8-second exposure. So here are all of these elements. We've got a little bit of rain, so that creates a little bit more reflection. We've got nighttime, we've got moving lights, we've got something interesting and different happening, which takes it from good, there it is with the truck gone, I haven't processed this image, the color temperatures aren't right and so on. It's just a completely different ball game. Completely different ball game. Anyway, that gives you the idea. And I will just show you This was a 16-second exposure. If you look over here on the right, 16-second exposure, ISO 50, 5.6. Don't need a big depth of field. It just doesn't matter. And this lens is super wide. So it's a 24, but it's equivalent to something like a 15 mil. And it's very good at dealing with distortions as well. So the Hasselblad, it's just a bit ridiculous.
Now, one might never think to put a garbage truck in a beautiful photograph, but an example of creating movement, and when I've talked about rain and nighttime and movement, this photograph here, which ended up on the cover of my book called Love Junk, actually has a garbage truck in it. And I think it's a far improved image because of that movement and the lighting that comes from that truck. So don't be afraid to do things that don't make sense. Often when you do things that aren't obvious, if you do things that break the norm, you will get results that inspire you and excite you. Not always, but sometimes. So that's how I do it. I do it with geography, time of day, weather conditions, and then looking for the very best opportunity once I've spotted it as I'm walking around. Your mind has to be opened, you have to be looking up, and you have to be breathing in the world. And as much as I love hanging out with other people, when I photograph with others versus photographing on my own, I find I get more successful hit rate when I'm fully focused on what I'm doing. One final point I want to make on top of all those other points I've made is just break the rules. Throw the rules out the window. It's going to be exciting and it's going to be freeing. So that is just an entry level. That is just the starting point of how I pull all of this together. I would love to know your techniques. I would love to know if any of that was helpful at all. I find this is largely a very innate experience for me, something learned over decades now, literally almost 40 years since I first put a camera to my face and 30 years since I was doing it as a living. I'd love to know your experiences. What motivates you and how do you find your frame? How do you choose the right gear? Do you go wide angle? Do you go long lens? Do you go tilt shift? What do you need to do? Well, as always, everybody, it is absolutely so lovely to see you today. And if this is your first time here, it is so very lovely to meet you. And I'd love to see you again. So please subscribe, please share, please like, helps get the word out there. And if you'd like to see over 200 episodes right now, you can just click down here on the Meadow and Photography. And I look forward to seeing you very, very soon. All right. Bye for now.